In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Arizona Territory, 1882, whispers followed ELENA MARTINEZ wherever she walked. The townspeople called her too loud and too forward for a proper woman. At 23, she spoke her mind when others stayed silent, defended the mistreated when others looked away, and refused to shrink herself to fit their narrow expectations. On this particular morning, as ELENA faced another round of cruel mockery outside the general store, a tall figure stepped from the shadows. Little Wolf, an Apache warrior with eyes like winter storms, had been watching the scene unfold. Without hesitation, he walked directly to ELENA, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "I'll marry you, so stop talk." The entire street fell silent. But what happened next would transform not just two lives, but an entire community's understanding of love and respect. How could 5 simple words change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as the crowd slowly dispersed, their whispered conversations carrying like tumbleweeds in the desert wind. ELENA MARTINEZ stood frozen where Little Wolf had left her, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The silver cross her grandmother had given her pressed warm against her chest, a reminder of faith in moments when the world seemed to turn upside down. Cedar Ridge was not a town that welcomed surprises, especially ones that challenged the careful order its citizens had built around their prejudices. Founded 12 years earlier by Anglo settlers seeking fortune in copper mining, it had grown into a community of rigid social expectations where everyone knew their place. Mexicans worked the mines or served in the cantinas. Indians were to be feared, fought, or forgotten. And women, particularly Mexican women, were expected to be seen but rarely heard. ELENA had never learned to follow that last rule. She walked past Henderson's general store, where the wooden sign still bore bullet holes from an Apache raid 3 summers past. Inside, she could hear the urgent whispers of Mrs. Henderson and her customers, their voices rising and falling like prayer responses in church. ELENA knew they were discussing her, dissecting every detail of what had just transpired, weaving it into the gossip that would spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire through dry grass. The store's ledger, kept by Mrs. Henderson's meticulous hand, contained more than just accounts of flour and ammunition. In its margins, the storekeeper recorded observations about her customers that revealed the true character of the town. ELENA had glimpsed those pages once, seeing her own name followed by words that stung worse than desert thorns. Troublesome, speaks out of turn, poor influence on other Mexican girls. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the saloon across the street, his badge catching the morning light. He was a fair man by frontier standards, but fairness in Cedar Ridge meant maintaining the peace between competing prejudices rather than eliminating them entirely. His weathered face showed concern as he approached ELENA, his boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk. "ELENA," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "that Apache fellow, do you know him?" "His name is Little Wolf," ELENA replied, lifting her chin with the defiance that had earned her such notorious reputation. "No, Sheriff Bradley, I don't know him personally, but I know enough to recognize honor when I see it." The sheriff's expression tightened. Honor was not a word most folks in Cedar Ridge associated with Indians, particularly Apache warriors. The recent wars had left wounds that festered in the collective memory of the territory. Stories of raids, kidnappings, and battles filled the local newspaper, each headline reinforcing the notion that the only good Indian was one kept far away from civilized society. "ELENA, I need you to understand something," Sheriff Bradley continued, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "That man's presence here could cause trouble, real trouble. There are folks in this town who lost family to Apache raids. They see him, they see an enemy." ELENA's dark eyes flashed with the fire that made her so formidable despite her small stature. She thought of her own family's struggles, how her father Miguel had worked 16-hour days in the copper mine to earn half what Anglo workers received for the same labor, how her mother Rosa cleaned houses for women who would barely acknowledge her existence, how her younger brothers faced daily taunts from children whose parents taught them that Mexican blood made a person lesser. "And what do they see when they look at me, Sheriff?" ELENA asked. Because I can tell you what I hear them whispering. They call me loud, forward, inappropriate. They say I don't know my place. Maybe that Apache warrior simply recognized someone else who doesn't fit into their neat little boxes. The sheriff removed his hat and ran his fingers through graying hair. He had known Elena since she was a child, had watched her grow from a spirited girl into a young woman whose intelligence and courage shamed many of the men in town. Her family had arrived in Cedar Ridge when she was 12, refugees from poverty and violence in Sonora. Miguel Martinez had proven himself a skilled miner and honest man, but even respect earned through sweat and blood couldn't fully overcome the color of his skin or the language he spoke at home. "Your father's a good man," Sheriff Bradley said finally, "and you're a good woman, Elena, even if you do speak your mind more than some folks think proper. But this situation with the Apache, it's different. It's dangerous." Elena adjusted the rebozo her mother had woven, its deep blue threads catching the light like captured sky. She thought of Little Wolf's words, so simple yet revolutionary in their directness. In a world where everything was complicated by prejudice and social climbing, he had cut through all the noise with 5 words that rang like a bell in the morning air. "Perhaps, Sheriff," Elena said quietly, "the most dangerous thing in Cedar Ridge isn't an Apache warrior. Perhaps it's the way we've all learned to hate what we don't understand." 3 miles north of Cedar Ridge, where the desert stretched toward distant mountains like a vast ocean of sand and sage, Little Wolf sat motionless on a red rock outcropping. His weathered hands rested on his knees as he gazed toward the town below, its buildings looking small and fragile against the endless sky. The morning's events played through his mind like shadows dancing on canyon walls. The medicine pouch at his side held the sacred items his grandmother had given him before the soldiers came, a piece of turquoise from the holy mountains, sage blessed by the medicine man, and a small carved bear that had belonged to his father. These objects connected him to a world that existed before treaties were broken and promises turned to ash. They reminded him who he was beneath the suspicion and hatred that followed him like vultures. Little Wolf had not always been alone. 2 winters past, he had lived with his band in the Dragoon Mountains, part of the last free Apache groups resisting the reservation system. They had moved like wind through the canyons, striking quick and disappearing before the cavalry could respond. But the wars that gave him his reputation as a fierce warrior had also cost him everything he held dear. His wife, Morning Star, had died in a cavalry attack on their hidden camp. She had been tending their young son when the soldiers struck at dawn. Little Wolf had been hunting, tracking deer to feed his family, when he heard the gunshots echoing off the canyon walls. By the time he returned, smoke rose from what had been his home, and the desert had claimed 2 more innocent lives. The rage that followed nearly consumed him. For months he had ridden with war parties, his heart frozen against all feeling except the need for vengeance. His skill with rifle and knife earned him respect among the warriors, but the violence only deepened the emptiness where his family had lived. When the last of his band finally surrendered to the reservation, Little Wolf chose exile instead. He had been watching Cedar Ridge for 3 moons now, surviving on his knowledge of desert plants and small game, avoiding the cavalry patrols that still searched for renegade Apaches. He told himself he was simply waiting for the right moment to head further south, perhaps to Mexico, where other Apache refugees had found sanctuary. But truthfully, something about the small frontier town had captured his attention. That something was Elena Martinez. The first time he saw her, she had been defending an old Mexican man from a group of drunken miners who were mocking his broken English. Elena had stood between them like a small thunderstorm, her words sharp as obsidian blades as she shamed them into backing down. Little Wolf had recognized something in her fierce protection of the helpless. It reminded him of his own grandmother, who had never hesitated to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. From his hidden vantage points in the hills, he had observed Elena's daily routines. He watched her help elderly women carry their market baskets, saw her teach children to read behind the church when their parents were working, witnessed her standing up to men twice her size when they treated others unfairly. In a world that had shown him mostly cruelty and broken promises, Elena Martinez represented something he had thought lost forever: genuine goodness, uncompromised by fear. Little Wolf understood the weight of his morning declaration. Apache warriors did not speak frivolous words, especially about marriage. Among his people, such pronouncements carried the force of sacred vows. When he had stepped from the shadows and claimed Elena as his intended bride, he had spoken from a truth deeper than conscious thought. The western wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain as Little Wolf rose from his meditation rock. His body moved with the fluid grace of someone raised in harmony with the natural world, every step calculated to leave minimal trace. The white man's towns confused him with their straight lines and artificial boundaries, but the desert remained his ally and teacher. His weapons, a rifle taken from a dead cavalry officer and a knife forged by his grandfather, were hidden in a cave along with his few possessions. Little Wolf had learned to travel light since becoming a fugitive, carrying only what was essential for survival. Yet today, after speaking those 5 words that had silenced an entire street, he felt burdened by possibilities he had not allowed himself to imagine. Could an Apache warrior and a Mexican woman truly build a life together in a world determined to keep them separate? Could love bridge the chasm that hatred and fear had carved between their peoples? Little Wolf had survived by accepting the harsh realities of frontier life, but Elena's fierce spirit had awakened something in him that insisted on hoping for more. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Little Wolf began his descent toward Cedar Ridge. The sacred items in his medicine pouch seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat, reminding him that some paths once chosen could not be abandoned without losing one's soul. The bronze bell atop the Cedar Ridge Community Hall had rung 3 times since Little Wolf's declaration, each toll spreading the news further through the settlement like ripples in a still pond. By noon, every soul within 10 miles knew that an Apache warrior had claimed ELENA MARTINEZ as his bride in front of half the town. The story grew with each telling, some versions painting Little Wolf as a savage kidnapper, others as a romantic hero from a dime novel. Elena found herself the center of attention in ways she had never experienced. Women who had previously crossed the street to avoid her now approached with curious smiles and probing questions. Men who had dismissed her as that troublesome Mexican girl suddenly regarded her with something approaching respect or perhaps fear of her mysterious Apache protector. "Elena! Elena, wait!" called Sarah Wilson, the banker's wife, hurrying across the dusty street with her skirts held high. Sarah had never spoken to Elena beyond perfunctory nods at church, but now her face glowed with excitement. "You simply must tell me everything about this Indian fellow. Is it true he's a war chief? Did he really fight against General Crook?" Elena paused beside the wooden hitching post outside Murphy's saloon, her patience wearing thin from similar encounters throughout the morning. The questions revealed more about Cedar Ridge's residents than any answers she might provide. To them, Little Wolf was either a dangerous savage or an exotic curiosity, never simply a man who had shown her unexpected kindness. "His name is Little Wolf," Elena replied carefully. "Beyond that, I know very little about him, Mrs. Wilson, but surely you must have some understanding with him," Sarah pressed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A man doesn't make such a public declaration without some prior arrangement. These Indian customs are so mysterious and primitive." Elena's dark eyes flashed with the anger that had made her notorious throughout the territory. She thought of her grandmother's stories about Spanish conquistadors who had called the Aztec Empire primitive while looting its gold, and American settlers who labeled Mexican land grants uncivilized while stealing the property for themselves. "Perhaps, Mrs. Wilson, what seems primitive is simply different from what we're accustomed to," Elena said, her voice carrying an edge that made Sarah step backward. Little Wolf showed more courage and honor this morning than most men demonstrate in a lifetime. The banker's wife retreated with wounded dignity, leaving Elena alone beside the hitching post where 3 horses dozed in the afternoon heat. She touched the silver cross at her throat, seeking comfort in the familiar weight of her grandmother's gift. The jewelry had been fashioned by Zapotec silversmiths in Oaxaca, its intricate patterns telling stories of faith, surviving conquest and persecution. From inside Murphy's saloon came the rough voices of miners and cowboys, debating the morning's events. Elena caught fragments of their conversation through the batwing doors, speculation about Little Wolf's intentions, crude jokes about taming savage squaws, and increasingly drunken suggestions about what should be done with that Apache bastard. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Elena's attention to the far end of Main Street, where a familiar figure rode toward town on a painted pony. Little Wolf sat his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, his long black hair moving like silk in the desert breeze. He had changed from his mourning clothes into traditional Apache dress, buckskin leggings, a blue cotton shirt, and a red bandana that contrasted sharply with his bronze skin. The conversations inside Murphy's saloon ceased abruptly as Little Wolf's presence was noticed. Men emerged onto the wooden sidewalk, some reaching instinctively for weapons they weren't carrying. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring as the Apache warrior guided his horse directly toward Elena. Seemingly oblivious to the hostile stares tracking his every movement, he dismounted with fluid motion and approached Elena, stopping at a respectful distance that acknowledged both her dignity and the watching crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Elena Martinez," he said, pronouncing her name with careful precision. "I have come to speak with you, if you will permit it." Elena felt every eye in Cedar Ridge upon them, measuring her response, ready to judge whatever choice she made. The silver cross pressed warm against her skin, and she thought of her grandmother's words about courage being a choice made in small moments as much as large ones. "I will listen," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street. Little Wolf nodded solemnly and gestured toward the wooden bench outside Henderson's general store. As they walked the short distance together, Elena heard the whispered conversations resume behind them, the town's gossip mill grinding their every gesture into speculation and scandal. The wooden bench creaked under their weight as Elena and Little Wolf sat side by side, an arm's length of desert air between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Elena's hands rested in her lap, clutching the leather-bound recipe book her mother had given her on her 16th birthday. The pages contained more than cooking instructions. They held Rosa Martinez's memories of Sonora, written in flowing Spanish script that connected 3 generations of women who had learned to survive in hostile territories. Little Wolf studied Elena's profile with the patience of a hunter, noting how she held herself with unconscious dignity despite the curious stares from every window and doorway on Main Street. Her dark hair caught the afternoon sun like polished obsidian, and her hands, though small, showed the calluses of honest work. She reminded him of the desert roses that bloomed in hidden canyons, beautiful but resilient, thriving in places where others wilted. "You are not afraid," Little Wolf observed, his English careful but clear. Each word carried the measured cadence of someone who had learned the language through necessity rather than choice. "Should I be?" Elena asked, turning to meet his gaze directly. His eyes were darker than winter storm clouds, holding depths that spoke of both terrible loss and unexpected gentleness. "Many white people fear Apache warriors, many Mexican people also." Elena opened her recipe book to a page covered in her mother's delicate handwriting, running her fingers over ingredients for mole poblano that required 27 different spices. The complexity reminded her of human nature, how the most beautiful things often came from combining elements that seemed incompatible. "My grandmother used to say that fear is just understanding wearing a mask," Elena replied. "When we remove the mask, we usually find that what frightened us was simply different from what we knew." Little Wolf's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a softening around his eyes that suggested her words had touched something deep within him. In his own language, his grandmother had spoken similar wisdom about the courage required to see clearly beyond surface appearances. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was. She lived through the Mexican War, watched American soldiers take our lands in Texas, saw how quickly neighbors could become enemies when governments changed flags overhead. Elena closed the recipe book and held it against her chest like armor. "She taught me that a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or the language they speak at home." A group of children had gathered near the corner of Henderson's store, their faces pressed against the window glass as they strained to observe the unprecedented sight of an Apache warrior and a Mexican woman sharing civil conversation. Elena recognized young Timothy Henderson among them, a freckled boy whose mother had warned him repeatedly about the dangers of savage Indians and treacherous Mexicans. "The children watch us like we are animals in a traveling show," Little Wolf noted without rancor. They have been taught to see enemies where they might see friends. Elena followed his gaze to the small faces peering through the glass. Timothy Henderson caught her eye and quickly ducked out of sight, but not before she saw the mixture of curiosity and fear in his expression. "Children learn what their parents teach them," she said quietly, "but they can also learn new lessons if someone is brave enough to teach them." Little Wolf reached into a small pouch at his side and withdrew something carved from pale wood. Elena watched as he revealed a small flute, its surface polished smooth by countless hours of handling. Intricate patterns decorated its length, symbols that spoke of wind and water, mountains and stars. "Apache men make music to speak what words cannot say," he explained, holding the instrument with obvious reverence. "This flute belonged to my father and his father before him. The songs it knows are older than the white man's towns, older than the Mexican missions." Without waiting for permission, Little Wolf raised the flute to his lips and began to play. The melody that emerged was unlike anything Elena had ever heard, haunting and beautiful, rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. The music spoke of loneliness and longing, of connection to the natural world, of love that transcended the boundaries humans created to separate themselves from one another. The children at the window stopped fidgeting. Conversations in nearby buildings ceased. Even the horses at the hitching posts seemed to listen with pricked ears as the ancient melody filled the afternoon air. When the last note faded, Little Wolf lowered the flute and looked at Elena with eyes that asked a question his lips had not yet formed. "That was beautiful," Elena whispered, feeling tears she hadn't expected prick at the corners of her eyes. "What was the song about?" "It tells the story of two spirits who meet across a great divide," Little Wolf replied. "They come from different worlds, but they recognize something in each other that their people cannot see." Elena understood that he was offering her more than music. He was sharing his soul. The days following their first conversation fell into a rhythm as natural as desert seasons. Elena would finish her morning chores, helping her mother with washing, tending the small vegetable garden behind their adobe house, preparing tortillas for her father's lunch, then walk to the old cottonwood tree beside Willow Creek, where Little Wolf waited with the patience of someone who understood that the most important things in life could not be rushed. Their conversations began tentatively, like deer approaching a water source, alert for danger, but driven by necessary thirst. Little Wolf spoke of his childhood in the Dragoon Mountains, where Apache children learned to read the stories written in animal tracks and shifting clouds. Elena shared memories of her grandmother's house in Sonora, where 3 generations of women had gathered each evening to embroider and share the wisdom of their ancestors. "Among my people," Little Wolf said one afternoon as they sat beside the quietly flowing creek, "a man must prove himself worthy through actions, not words alone. A warrior earns respect by protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Elena watched a hawk circle overhead, its wings motionless as it rode the thermal currents rising from the sun-baked earth. "In my family's village, my grandmother was known as a curandera, a healer. She said that the strongest medicine comes from understanding that all living things are connected, that harming one harms all." Little Wolf nodded thoughtfully. These conversations revealed the common ground beneath their different traditions. Both cultures valued honor, family loyalty, and respect for the natural world. Both had suffered under the expansion of American settlers who saw the land as something to be conquered rather than lived with in harmony. During their third meeting, Little Wolf brought Elena a gift that took her breath away. Wrapped in soft deerskin was a necklace he had crafted from silver, traded with Mexican merchants, and turquoise he had gathered from a sacred site in the Chiricahua Mountains. The pendant bore the image of a hummingbird, its wings spread in eternal flight. "Among Apache people, the hummingbird is a messenger between worlds," he explained as Elena lifted the delicate piece with trembling fingers. "It can fly in any direction, forward, backward, even upside down. It teaches us that love makes all movements possible." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she understood the deeper meaning. Little Wolf was telling her that their love could transcend the boundaries that others saw as absolute. Like the hummingbird, they could find ways to move through a world that insisted certain paths were impossible. "I cannot accept this," she whispered, though her heart ached to refuse such beauty. "The town already watches our every meeting. If I wear Apache jewelry—" "Then let them watch," Little Wolf replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Let them see that beauty can grow where they expect only conflict." Elena's hands shook as she fastened the necklace around her throat, feeling the cool weight of silver and stone settle against her skin. The hummingbird seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, reminding her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That evening, when Elena returned home wearing the necklace, her mother, Rosa Martinez, noticed immediately. The older woman's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, concern, understanding, and finally, a resignation born of love for her daughter's independent spirit. "Mija," Rosa said quietly as they prepared dinner together, "you know this path will not be easy. There are people in this town who will never accept what you are choosing." Elena continued chopping onions for the evening stew, her movements precise despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Mama, I spent my whole life trying to be small enough to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. Little Wolf sees me as I truly am, not as others wish I would become." Rosa reached out and touched the hummingbird pendant, her work-worn fingers tracing its delicate wings. "Your grandmother had a necklace very much like this. She wore it when she married your grandfather, despite her family's objections. They said a Spanish girl should not marry a Mexican Indian, that their children would belong to neither world." Elena looked up in surprise. Her grandmother had rarely spoken of her early life, preferring to focus on the present rather than dwell on old struggles. What happened to them? They built their own world, one where love mattered more than other people's narrow definitions. Rosa smiled sadly, but it cost them greatly. Some bridges can only be built by walking across flames. As if summoned by their conversation, Miguel Martinez entered the kitchen, his face and clothes dusty from another long day in the copper mine. He noticed the necklace immediately, his expression growing grave as he recognized its significance. "So it has gone this far," he said quietly, accepting the cup of coffee Rosa offered him. The storm clouds had been gathering over Cedar Ridge for weeks, and they weren't the kind that brought rain. Sheriff Tom Bradley polished his badge with unusual care as he prepared for what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of his career. The silver star felt heavier than usual against his vest, weighted with the authority he was about to exercise against his better judgment. A delegation of Cedar Ridge's most prominent citizens had requested this meeting, and Bradley knew their demands before they spoke them. Mayor Franklin Pierce, banker Charles Wilson, mine foreman Dutch Vanderberg, and cattle rancher Big Jim Morrison filled his small office like storm clouds, their faces set with the determination of men who believed their comfort was being threatened. "Sheriff," Mayor Pierce began without preamble, "this situation with the Martinez girl and that Apache has gone on long enough. The town council has voted unanimously that Indian needs to be removed from our vicinity before he causes real trouble." Bradley leaned back in his chair, studying the faces of men he had known for years. Some were neighbors, others regular poker partners, all of them decent folks in their own way. But decency, he had learned, could be a fragile thing when fear took hold. "Has Little Wolf broken any laws?" Bradley asked, though he already knew the answer. "He's Apache," Dutch Vanderberg spat, his Dutch accent thickening with emotion. "My brother was killed at Apache Pass. That's enough law for me." "Your brother was a soldier, Dutch. He died fighting other Apache warriors, not this man specifically." Big Jim Morrison shifted his considerable bulk forward, his massive hands gripping the arms of the wooden chair until it creaked in protest. "Tom, you know as well as anyone that Indians don't belong in civilized towns. They're savages by nature. This one might be acting peaceful now, but sooner or later his true nature will show." Bradley thought of Little Wolf's careful demeanor during their few encounters, the warrior's obvious respect for Elena, and restraint in the face of constant hostility. If anything, the Apache showed more civilization than many of the white men currently filling his office. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Bradley asked, though he dreaded the answer. Mayor Pierce produced a telegram from his coat pocket, unfolding it with theatrical precision. "I've been in communication with the territorial governor's office. They confirm that any Apache not currently on a reservation is considered a hostile and subject to immediate arrest." "On what charges? Does it matter?" Banker Wilson interjected. "The point is to get him away from our women and children before something terrible happens." Bradley felt the familiar weight of compromise settling on his shoulders like a yoke. He had spent his entire career walking the narrow line between justice and keeping the peace, but this situation threatened to force him into territory he had hoped never to enter. And what about ELENA Martinez? Are you planning to arrest her too for talking to him? That girl has always been trouble, Dutch growled. Maybe a few days in jail would teach her some proper respect. Now hold on, Bradley said, his voice hardening. ELENA Martinez is an American citizen with rights under the law. I won't arrest someone for having conversations. Big Jim Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone he used when threatening business rivals. Tom, you've been sheriff here for 12 years. The town council has always supported you, backed your decisions, overlooked your flexible interpretations of territorial law. But this situation is different. This threatens the very foundation of what we've built here. The threat was clear, without being explicitly stated. Bradley's job depended on the goodwill of these men and others like them. A sheriff who couldn't maintain order was a sheriff who wouldn't keep his badge long. But ELENA Martinez had done nothing wrong except fall in love with someone the town disapproved of, and Little Wolf had committed no crime beyond being born Apache. I need time to think about this, Bradley said finally. Time is a luxury we don't have, Mayor Pierce replied. Every day that Apache remains here, tensions increase. I've heard talk in the saloons, Tom. Some of the boys are discussing taking matters into their own hands if official channels fail them. Bradley's blood chilled at the implication. Vigilante justice was swift, brutal, and usually fatal for anyone unlucky enough to be its target. He had seen the aftermath of lynch mobs in other towns, bodies left hanging from trees as warnings to others who might challenge the established order. Give me 48 hours, Bradley said, rising from his chair to signal the meeting's end. I'll find a solution that satisfies everyone. The delegation exchanged glances before Mayor Pierce nodded curtly. 48 hours, Sheriff. After that, concerned citizens might feel compelled to act on their own initiative. After they left, Bradley sat alone in his office, staring at the badge in his hands and wondering if wearing it was worth the compromises it demanded. The desert at night held secrets that daylight could never reveal. 3 miles from Cedar Ridge, where the ancient saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels against the star-filled sky, Little Wolf and ELENA found sanctuary in a world older than human prejudice. Here, beneath the vast dome of desert heaven, they could speak freely without the weight of watching eyes and whispered judgments. Little Wolf had spread a woven blanket on the sandy ground, its patterns telling stories of his grandmother's people who had lived in harmony with this harsh landscape for countless generations. ELENA sat beside him, her mother's rebozo wrapped around her shoulders against the desert chill, listening as he shared the knowledge passed down through Apache oral tradition. Each star has a story, Little Wolf said, pointing toward the constellation his people called the Dancing Bear. My grandfather taught me to read the sky like white men read books. The stars tell us when to plant, when to harvest, when to move camp for better hunting. ELENA followed his gaze upward, seeing patterns she had never noticed before. Her own grandmother had spoken of reading signs in nature, but Mexican traditions focused more on the earth, the turning of seasons, the behavior of animals, the wisdom hidden in growing things. In my family's village, ELENA replied, we watched the moon for guidance. My grandmother could predict weather changes weeks in advance by studying how the moonlight fell on certain stones near our house. Little Wolf reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a piece of folded duskin. When he opened it, ELENA gasped at what lay inside, a star map painted on the soft leather, with pigments made from desert minerals. The artwork was breathtaking in its detail, showing not just the positions of stars, but their relationships to each other and to the sacred places of Apache territory. This map has been in my family for 7 generations, Little Wolf explained, his voice carrying the reverence reserved for holy things. Each father teaches his son to read its meaning, to understand that we are all connected to the great wheel of sky and earth. ELENA studied the intricate painting with wonder. The star map represented more than astronomical knowledge. It was a connection to ancestors, a guide for navigation both physical and spiritual, a reminder that human life was part of something infinitely larger and more meaningful than daily struggles. Will you teach me? She asked quietly. Little Wolf's eyes reflected starlight as he looked at her. Apache knowledge is sacred. It is not given lightly to those outside the tribe. And what am I to you? ELENA asked, meeting his gaze directly. Am I outside your tribe, or am I family? The question hung between them like incense, heavy with implications that could change everything. Little Wolf had spoken casually of marriage that first morning, but here in the sacred silence of the desert, ELENA was asking him to clarify his true intentions. Among my people, Little Wolf said slowly, when a man chooses a woman as his wife, she becomes Apache. Her children belong to the tribe, carry our blood and our knowledge forward into the future. And if that woman is Mexican, if her children will be both Apache and Mexican, never fully accepted by either world. Little Wolf was quiet for a long moment, studying the star map as if seeking guidance from his ancestors. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then we will create a new world where such children are treasured for carrying the best of both peoples. ELENA felt tears prick her eyes at the simple power of his words. In a territory where mixed-blood children often faced rejection from all communities, Little Wolf was proposing something revolutionary, a family that would celebrate rather than hide its diverse heritage. "Show me the stars," she whispered. For the next hour, Little Wolf guided ELENA through the Apache understanding of the night sky. He showed her the hunter's path that pointed toward water in the dry season, the mother's arms that embraced the spirits of departed children, the warrior's lance that indicated the best times for important decisions. As ELENA learned to see the patterns Little Wolf described, she understood that he was offering her more than astronomical knowledge. He was inviting her into a worldview that saw connection where others saw separation, harmony where others saw conflict, hope where others saw only darkness. "There," Little Wolf said, pointing to a cluster of stars near the horizon. "Those 7 stars are called the 7 Sisters. Apache legend says they were 7 women who loved the same warrior. Instead of fighting each other, they chose to become eternal companions, dancing together in the sky for all time." ELENA smiled at the story's message. "Perhaps love is not about choosing sides," she said. "Perhaps it is about finding ways to dance together despite our differences." Little Wolf took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers beneath the endless canopy of stars. In that moment, ELENA knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home. The morning sun painted the adobe walls of the Martinez home in shades of gold and amber as ELENA sat at her mother's kitchen table, turning her father's simple gold wedding band over in her palm. Miguel had worked extra shifts in the copper mine for 6 months to afford this ring before proposing to Rosa 25 years ago. The metal was worn smooth by decades of honest labor, but it still caught the light with the same promise it had carried on their wedding day. "Papa," ELENA said softly, "tell me about the day you asked Mama to marry you." Miguel Martinez looked up from his morning coffee, his weathered face creasing into a smile that made him appear 20 years younger. He had returned from the mine the previous evening to find his daughter wearing Apache jewelry and his wife looking at him with eyes that said everything without speaking a word. "Ah, Mija, that was a different time," Miguel replied, settling back in his chair with the contentment of a man who enjoyed remembering happier days. "Your mother's father hated me. I was too dark, too poor, too Indian for his Spanish daughter. But your mama, she had a will like iron wrapped in silk." Rosa Martinez emerged from the back room where she had been mending clothes, her hands still holding needle and thread. At 45, she retained the grace that had caught Miguel's eye in the church plaza of their village, though silver now streaked her dark hair and laugh lines mapped the territory around her eyes. "Your father was the most stubborn man in all of Sonora," Rosa said with affection. "He courted me for 2 years before my father would even allow him to speak to me directly." ELENA studied her parents' faces, seeing in their weathered features the same determination that now burned in her own heart. These 2 people had built a life together despite family opposition, economic hardship, and the constant challenges of existing between 2 cultures. "How did you know?" ELENA asked. "How did you know he was worth fighting for?" Miguel and Rosa exchanged a look that spoke of shared understanding accumulated over decades of marriage. Rosa set down her mending and joined them at the table, her work-worn hands folding neatly in her lap. "The day I knew," Rosa said quietly, "was when my little brother Carlos fell into the river during flood season. Your father jumped in without hesitation, nearly drowned himself pulling Carlos to safety. Afterward, when my family was thanking him, Miguel said something I will never forget." She paused, touching the simple silver cross at her throat, not as elaborate as ELENA's Apache necklace, but equally precious for the faith it represented. he said. A man who truly loves a woman must love her family as his own, because they are the roots that made her who she is. That night I knew I would marry him regardless of what anyone else thought. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she understood the deeper message. Her parents were telling her that love worthy of sacrifice revealed itself through actions, not words, through the willingness to risk everything for those who mattered most. Little Wolf asked me to marry him the first morning we met, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. But yesterday in the desert he asked me again. This time it was different. This time he was asking ELENA MARTINEZ, not just any woman who needed defending. Miguel leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "And what did you tell him?" I told him yes. The words hung in the kitchen air like morning mist, visible and transformative. Rosa reached across the table and took Elena's hands in her own, feeling the slight tremor that revealed her daughter's mixture of determination and fear. "Then we must begin planning a wedding," Rosa said simply. Miguel's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "Rosa, do you understand what this means? The town will store. The town will do what towns always do." Rosa interrupted, her voice carrying the steel that had helped her survive 2 decades in a foreign country. "They will gossip and judge, and eventually find something else to occupy their attention. But our daughter will have only one chance to marry the man she loves." Elena pulled the gold wedding band from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. "Little Wolf wants to follow both Apache and Mexican traditions. He says a marriage should honor the families that created the bride and groom." Miguel stared at his wedding ring, seeing in its worn surface the reflection of his own young dreams. When he looked up at Elena, his eyes held the wisdom of a man who had learned that happiness was too precious to sacrifice on the altar of other people's expectations. "Then we will give you a wedding that honors both your heritage and your choice," he said firmly. "Your grandmother would expect no less." Elena felt the last barriers around her heart dissolve as she realized her family would stand with her, regardless of the cost. The dust cloud on the horizon appeared at dawn, moving like a desert storm across the vast expanse between the Dragoon Mountains and Cedar Ridge. Little Wolf saw it first from his observation point on the red rocks, his warrior's instincts immediately alert to the significance of multiple riders approaching from Apache territory. He counted the dust plumes, 7 horses, moving with the purposeful coordination of a war party rather than the random patterns of wild mustangs or cavalry patrol. By the time the riders crested the final ridge, Little Wolf could make out their faces and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Leading the group was Broken Arrow, a war chief whose painted face bore the distinctive markings of the Chiricahua resistance fighters. Behind him rode 6 warriors, Little Wolf recognized from the old days, men whose names were whispered with equal parts fear and respect throughout the territory. Little Wolf descended from his lookout post with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to move silently across desert terrain. He knew why they had come, and the knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. 3 months ago, before he had ever seen ELENA MARTINEZ, before love had changed the direction of his life, Little Wolf had been accused of stealing cavalry horses during a raid near Fort Bowie. The accusation was false. He had been hunting alone, miles from the scene, but Apache justice demanded that accused warriors face judgment from their peers. The war party made camp in a hidden canyon 2 miles from Cedar Ridge, following protocols established during decades of avoiding cavalry patrols. Little Wolf approached their fire as the sun reached its zenith, his hands empty of weapons to signal peaceful intentions, though he knew these men could kill him before he could draw breath to protest. Broken Arrow looked up from sharpening his knife, his scarred face showing neither welcome nor hostility. "Little Wolf, you are difficult to find. I did not know anyone was looking for me. The army blames you for stolen horses. Our people suffer because of your alleged crimes. You will return with us to face the council's judgment." Little Wolf settled onto his heels beside the fire, accepting a piece of dried venison from one of the younger warriors. The familiar taste of his people's food reminded him of all he had left behind when he chose exile over reservation life. "What evidence speaks against me?" Little Wolf asked, though he suspected the answer would reveal more about politics than justice. "The cavalry found Apache arrows at the scene. You are known to use the 4-feather fletching of your grandfather's clan. The army demands an Apache be punished, or they will punish all Apache in the area." Little Wolf understood the terrible mathematics of frontier justice. One Apache would suffer so that many might be spared. The tribal council would weigh his life against the safety of women and children confined to reservation boundaries, and their choice was predetermined by survival necessity. "I did not steal cavalry horses," Little Wolf said quietly. "Perhaps not, but you have been living among white people, taking a Mexican woman as wife. Some say you have forgotten your Apache heart." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of feared truth. Little Wolf had found happiness with ELENA that made his old life of constant warfare seem empty and purposeless. He had begun to imagine a future focused on creation rather than destruction, on building something beautiful instead of enduring endless cycles of revenge. "My heart remains Apache," Little Wolf replied, "but it has grown large enough to love beyond the boundaries of tribe and race." Broken Arrow's expression showed the contempt of a man who saw such sentiment as weakness. "Love is a luxury warriors cannot afford. You will return with us, or we will drag you back as a deserter and coward." Little Wolf looked toward Cedar Ridge, thinking of ELENA waiting by their cottonwood tree, probably wondering why he had not appeared for their afternoon meeting. She would be wearing the hummingbird necklace, her dark eyes bright with the happiness their growing love had brought to her life. The thought of disappointing her felt like a physical wound, but he also thought of Apache children confined to reservation boundaries, dependent on government rations that arrived sporadically and often spoiled. If his death or imprisonment would purchase their safety, how could he choose personal happiness over tribal responsibility? "I will not run from false accusations," Little Wolf said finally, "but I ask for 3 days to arrange my affairs." "1 day," Broken Arrow countered. "At sunset tomorrow, you ride with us or we take you by force." As the war party prepared to depart for their hidden camp, Little Wolf realized that his declaration of love for ELENA might have doomed them both. ELENA knew something was wrong the moment she saw Little Wolf approaching their meeting place by the cottonwood tree. His usually fluid walk carried tension in every step, and his dark eyes held the storm clouds she had learned to recognize when he wrestled with memories of his warrior past. She rose from the fallen log where she had been waiting, her grandmother's blue shawl wrapped around her shoulders like protective armor. "What has happened?" she asked, reading the gravity in his expression with the intuition that had grown between them like a living thing. Little Wolf took her hands in his, feeling the slight tremor that revealed her growing fear. He had spent the afternoon searching for words that might soften the blow he was about to deliver, but Apache directness was too deeply ingrained in his nature for elaborate deceptions. "Warriors from my former band have come for me," he said simply. "They believe I committed crimes against the cavalry. I must return with them to face tribal judgment." ELENA's face went pale beneath her olive complexion, but her grip on his hands tightened rather than loosening. "What crimes? You have been here with me. What could you possibly have done?" "Nothing, but the army demands Apache blood for stolen horses, and my former war chief believes my surrender will protect our people from retaliation." The afternoon wind stirred the cottonwood leaves above them, creating shadows that danced across ELENA's face as she processed this information. She had always known that Little Wolf's past as a warrior made their future uncertain, but she had allowed herself to hope that love might prove stronger than the forces arrayed against them. "When?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Tomorrow at sunset." ELENA released his hands and stepped backward, her mind racing through possibilities like a caged bird seeking escape. The blue shawl her grandmother had woven slipped from her shoulders, and she caught it reflexively, her fingers finding comfort in the familiar texture of wool and memory. "No," she said firmly. Little Wolf's expression showed surprise at her simple refusal to accept what he saw as inevitable fate. "ELENA, I cannot fight my own people. If I resist, they will brand me a traitor and hunt me across the territory. There would be no safety for either of us, and if you go with them, what happens to you then?" Little Wolf looked away, unable to meet her eyes while speaking the truth they both understood. Apache justice for serious crimes is swift and final. ELENA's heart felt as though it were being torn from her chest, but her mind remained clear with the determination that had always made her formidable despite her small stature. She thought of her grandmother's stories about Spanish conquistadors who had tried to break the spirit of indigenous women, and how those women had found ways to resist that their oppressors never anticipated. "There is another choice." Elena said, her voice gaining strength with each word. You said that when an Apache warrior takes a wife, she becomes part of the tribe, that her words carry the weight of family kinship. Elena, what are you thinking? She stepped forward and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze directly. I am thinking that if I am your wife, truly your wife by Apache law, then I have the right to speak at your trial. I have the right to stand beside you and demand they hear the truth. Little Wolf's eyes widened as he understood the magnitude of what she was proposing. You would face a council of Apache war chiefs, men who have spent their lives fighting Mexican and American soldiers. They would see you as an enemy. Let them try, Elena replied, her voice carrying the same fierce protection she had shown defending others throughout her life. I am ELENA MARTINEZ, granddaughter of a woman who survived conquest and daughter of people who built new lives from the ashes of old worlds. I will not let them take you based on lies. The courage in her words humbled Little Wolf more than any act of warfare he had ever witnessed. This small Mexican woman was willing to walk into the heart of Apache territory, to face warriors who might kill her for her presumption, all for the sake of their love. The tribal council recognizes only marriages performed according to ancient traditions, Little Wolf said slowly. The ceremony would have to happen tonight, before they take me away. Elena smiled for the first time since their conversation began, and Little Wolf saw in her expression the same indomitable spirit that had first caught his attention in the dusty street of Cedar Ridge. Then we should stop wasting time talking and start planning a wedding, she said. The blue shawl fluttered in the wind like a banner of defiance as ELENA MARTINEZ made her choice to fight for love against impossible odds. The sacred white sage burned in a clay bowl borrowed from Elena's mother, its purifying smoke rising toward the star-filled desert sky, like prayers made visible. Little Wolf had gathered the herb from a hidden canyon, where his grandmother once taught him to distinguish between plants that healed and those that harmed. Now, as he prepared to bind his life to Elena's through ancient Apache ceremonies, the sage would cleanse them both for the sacred transformation ahead. Elena knelt beside him on the woven blanket, her grandmother's blue shawl replaced by a simple white dress Rosa Martinez had sewn in frantic haste during the afternoon. The garment was made from cotton her mother had been saving for Elena's wedding day, whenever that blessed event might occur. Rosa had never imagined it would happen under such desperate circumstances, with Apache warriors camped in the nearby hills and her daughter preparing to risk everything for love. Miguel Martinez stood witness to the ceremony, his weathered hands holding the family Bible that had survived their journey from Sonora. Beside him, Rosa clutched her rosary beads while tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. They had agreed to honor both Apache and Mexican traditions, creating a marriage ceremony that reflected the blending of two worlds in their daughter's brave heart. Among my people, Little Wolf said, his voice carrying the formal cadence reserved for sacred rituals, marriage is not just the joining of two persons, but the creation of new family bonds that extend across generations. He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small eagle feather, its surface painted with symbols representing the four directions and the endless cycle of seasons. The feather had belonged to his grandfather, a medicine man whose wisdom guided Apache warriors through the darkest periods of war with the cavalry. This feather carries the blessing of my ancestors, Little Wolf continued, placing it gently in Elena's hair. When you wear it, you carry their protection and their acceptance into our tribal family. Elena felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders as the feather touched her scalp. She thought of the generations of Apache women who had worn similar sacred objects, who had loved and lost and endured through centuries of struggle to preserve their people's way of life. For her part of the ceremony, Elena offered Little Wolf a small silver cross that had been blessed by the priest in her childhood village. The cross was not the elaborate hummingbird necklace he had given her, but something more intimate, a symbol of the faith that had sustained her family through exile, poverty, and the constant challenge of existing between cultures. This cross represents my family's journey from old Mexico to this new land, Elena said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. When you wear it, you carry our blessings and our acceptance of you as our son. Little Wolf accepted the cross with reverence, understanding that Elena was offering him something precious beyond its material value. Like the eagle feather, It represented the joining of spiritual traditions that others saw as incompatible, but which their love had revealed as complementary. Miguel stepped forward, opening the family Bible to a passage Rosa had marked with a pressed wildflower. His voice carried the weight of paternal blessing as he read words that spoke of love conquering fear, of faith moving mountains, of two people becoming one flesh before God and community. Rosa approached with a length of rope she had braided from 3 different colored threads, white for Apache purity, red for Mexican passion, and blue for the hope they carried for their children's future. Following a tradition Little Wolf had described from his grandmother's teachings, she bound their hands together while speaking words of blessing in Spanish, and the few Apache phrases Little Wolf had taught her. "May your love be as enduring as the desert stars," Rosa said, "and may your children walk proudly in both worlds their parents have given them." As their hands were bound, Elena felt the sacred power of commitment flowing between them like electricity. This was not the elaborate church wedding she had imagined as a young girl, but something deeper and more meaningful, a ceremony that honored the courage required to love beyond the boundaries society had drawn. The sage smoke continued rising toward the stars as Little Wolf and Elena spoke their vows in 2 languages, their words carrying across the desert silence to where Apache warriors waited in hidden canyons. Whether those warriors would respect this marriage or see it as another betrayal remained to be discovered. But in this moment, surrounded by family and blessed by ancient traditions, ELENA MARTINEZ became Little Wolf's wife in the eyes of both their peoples. When the ceremony concluded, the newlyweds looked toward the eastern horizon where dawn would soon bring their greatest test. The confrontation came at dawn, when the first light painted the desert rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Elena rode beside Little Wolf toward the hidden canyon where Broken Arrow's war party waited, her mother's wedding veil streaming behind her like a banner of defiance. The delicate lace, yellowed with age but still beautiful, had covered Rosa Martinez's face on her own wedding day, 25 years earlier. Now it crowned Elena's dark hair as she prepared to face Apache justice for the man she loved. Elena sat her horse with the confidence her father had taught her during childhood rides through the hills above their Mexican village. The mare beneath her was steady and sure-footed, traits that would serve her well in the rocky terrain ahead. But more importantly, the animal seemed to sense its rider's determination and moved with the purposeful gait of a warhorse, carrying a warrior into battle. Little Wolf glanced at his new wife with a mixture of pride and terror. In the growing light, Elena appeared transformed from the woman he had married by starlight only hours before. The white wedding dress had been replaced by practical riding clothes, but she wore the eagle feather in her hair and the silver cross at her throat like talismans of protection. Her dark eyes held no trace of fear, only the fierce resolve that had first attracted him to her. "You understand what we are riding toward?" Little Wolf asked, though he knew Elena's mind was made up beyond any possibility of changing. "I understand that my husband has been falsely accused, and I will not allow lies to destroy our future," Elena replied, her voice carrying across the morning air with absolute certainty. They rode in silence as the sun climbed higher, each lost in thoughts of what lay ahead. Elena prayed to the Virgin of Guadalupe for courage, while Little Wolf sought guidance from the spirit of his grandfather, whose eagle feather now adorned his wife's hair. Both drew strength from the certainty that their love was worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The hidden canyon opened before them like a mouth in the earth, its red walls carved by centuries of flash floods and desert winds. Elena could smell the smoke from Apache fires, hear the low voices of warriors preparing for the day's proceedings. Her horses' hooves clicked against stone as they descended into the heart of Apache territory, each step taking her further from the familiar world of Cedar Ridge and deeper into a realm governed by laws she barely understood. Broken Arrow waited beside a central fire, his painted face impassive as he watched the approaching riders. Behind him, 6 Apache warriors sat in judgment, their weapons within easy reach but not openly displayed. Elena recognized the respect implicit in this courtesy. These men were treating her as a guest rather than an enemy, at least for the moment. Little Wolf dismounted first, then moved to help Elena from her horse with the formal courtesy required by the situation's gravity. As her feet touched the canyon floor, Elena felt the weight of history pressing down upon her. No Mexican woman had ever appeared before an Apache war council, much less demanded the right to speak in defense of an accused warrior. Broken Arrow, Little Wolf said, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for tribal proceedings. I present my wife, ELENA MARTINEZ, who claims the right to speak as family in matters concerning my fate. The war chief's scarred face showed surprise at ELENA's presence, followed by calculation as he assessed this unexpected development. Apache law was ancient and specific. Family members could indeed speak for accused warriors, but only if their marriage was recognized as legitimate by tribal standards. This woman is Mexican, Broken Arrow stated, as if ELENA's heritage disqualified her from Apache protection. ELENA stepped forward, the wedding veil catching the morning breeze, as she lifted her chin with the same defiance that had made her notorious throughout Cedar Ridge. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who refused to be diminished by other people's prejudices. I am ELENA MARTINEZ, wife of Little Wolf, daughter of Miguel Martinez, granddaughter of Maria Santos, who survived conquest and chose life over surrender, she declared, her words echoing off the canyon walls. I claim the right to speak for my husband because Apache law recognizes marriage bonds regardless of the bride's previous tribe. Broken Arrow exchanged glances with the other warriors, their expressions revealing grudging respect for ELENA's knowledge of tribal customs and her courage in invoking them. One of the older warriors nodded slightly, acknowledging the legal precedent ELENA had cited. You may speak, Broken Arrow conceded, his tone suggesting this concession came reluctantly. But understand that your words carry the same weight as your husband's life. If you lie or waste our time, you will share his punishment. ELENA smiled with the same fierce joy she had shown defending others throughout her life in Cedar Ridge. ELENA's voice rang clear and unwavering across the canyon as she began her defense of Little Wolf. But her words were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, echoing off the red stone walls. The Apache warriors tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons as a lone rider appeared at the canyon's entrance. The figure was unmistakably white, tall, wearing a cavalry hat and riding with the purposeful urgency of someone bearing important news. Sheriff Tom Bradley descended into the hidden canyon with his hands raised to show peaceful intentions, though ELENA could see the tension in his weathered face. Behind him, at a respectful distance, rode Father Martinez from the Cedar Ridge mission, his black robes fluttering in the morning breeze like the wings of some benevolent spirit. I request permission to speak, Sheriff Bradley called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the formal tone he used in courtrooms. I bring evidence that concerns this man's innocence. Broken Arrow's painted face showed suspicion, but one of the older warriors whispered something in Apache that made the war chief nod reluctantly. Speak quickly, lawman. Apache justice does not wait for white man's convenience. Bradley reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather pouch, from which he produced several items that gleamed in the morning sunlight. ELENA recognized them immediately. Apache arrows, but not the kind Little Wolf crafted. These bore the distinctive red and black fletching of a different clan, and their iron points showed recent use. 3 days ago, Bradley announced, my deputy arrested a white man named Jake Morrison trying to sell cavalry horses in Tucson. When we searched his belongings, we found these arrows. He confessed to planting them at the scene of the theft to make it appear Apache raiders were responsible. The canyon fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through stone. ELENA felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the magnitude of what Sheriff Bradley was revealing. Little Wolf had been innocent all along, as they had both known, but now there was proof that could save his life. Why should we believe the word of white soldiers? Broken Arrow demanded, though ELENA detected uncertainty beneath his hostility. Father Martinez stepped forward, carrying an object that made ELENA gasp with recognition. In his hands was an Apache peace pipe, its carved bowl decorated with symbols that spoke of harmony between peoples. The priest's knowledge of tribal customs surprised everyone present, but ELENA remembered hearing that he had lived among various tribes before taking his vows. Because I was there when Jake Morrison confessed, Father Martinez said in carefully pronounced Apache words that showed years of study. This man's grandfather traded this pipe to my mission 20 years ago as a symbol of peaceful relations between our peoples. I return it now as witness to the truth. Little Wolf's expression showed amazement as he recognized the sacred pipe. His grandfather had indeed traded such an item to build goodwill with the Mexican priests who had shown kindness to Apache families during the worst years of the wars. The pipe's return carried spiritual significance that even Broken Arrow could not ignore. Jake Morrison is Big Jim Morrison's nephew, Sheriff Bradley continued, producing a written confession from his pocket. He stole the horses to pay gambling debts, then blamed Apache raiders to avoid suspicion falling on his family. His uncle will be charged as an accessory for trying to cover up the crime. Elena watched the faces of the Apache warriors as they processed this information. She could see the wheels of justice turning in their minds, weighing evidence and testimony according to laws older than any white settlement. The truth was emerging like sunrise after a long night of darkness. One of the older warriors spoke quietly to Broken Arrow in rapid Apache, pointing toward the peace pipe and the physical evidence Sheriff Bradley had brought. Elena couldn't understand the words, but their tone suggested respect for the proof that had been presented. If this is true, Broken Arrow said slowly, then Little Wolf has been wrongly accused. But why did white lawmen come here to defend Apache warrior? Sheriff Bradley glanced at Elena, seeing in her determined face the same courage that had inspired him to risk his career by riding into Apache territory. Because justice belongs to all people, regardless of the color of their skin, and because this woman taught me that love is stronger than hatred, if we have the courage to let it be. Elena felt tears of relief gathering in her eyes as she realized that their love had not only survived its greatest test, but had transformed the hearts of those who witnessed it. The peace pipe passed from hand to hand among the warriors, its sacred presence blessing the truth that was setting them all free. 6 months after the canyon confrontation that cleared Little Wolf's name, Elena stood before a classroom of children in Cedar Ridge's newly constructed community building, holding a small slate board that had become the symbol of her role as cultural bridge between worlds. The building itself represented the town's gradual transformation, constructed with labor contributed by Anglo-Mexican and Apache workers. It served as meeting place, school, and celebration hall for a community learning to embrace its diversity. The children gathered around Elena came from all 3 cultures that now coexisted in Cedar Ridge. Timothy Henderson, the freckled boy who had once pressed his face against his mother's store window to stare at Elena and Little Wolf, now sat eagerly in the front row beside Maria Santos, a Mexican girl whose family had arrived from Sonora the previous month. Behind them, 2 Apache children from families who had chosen to settle near the town rather than remain on distant reservations listened with bright eyes as Elena taught them to write English letters. "Today we will learn about the stars," Elena announced, her voice carrying the confidence that motherhood and community acceptance had brought to her life. She was visibly pregnant now, her expanding belly a testament to the new life growing within her, a child who would embody the blending of cultures their love had made possible. Little Wolf entered the classroom, carrying his grandfather's star map, the sacred duskin that had once been reserved for Apache eyes alone. The children turned to greet him with enthusiasm that would have been impossible before the events in the canyon had transformed their community's understanding of what an Apache warrior could be. "Children," Elena continued, "Little Wolf will show you how his people read the night sky. You will discover that the same stars we used to find our way home also guided your Apache neighbors across the desert for countless generations." As Little Wolf unrolled the star map on Elena's desk, young Timothy Henderson raised his hand with a question that demonstrated how much their world had changed. "Mr. Little Wolf, my pa says you and Mrs. Elena are teaching us Apache wisdom. Does that make us part Apache too?" Little Wolf's face creased into the gentle smile that Elena had fallen in love with during their desert courtship. Apache wisdom belongs to anyone wise enough to learn it, just as Mexican knowledge of healing plants and Anglo skills with written words can be shared among all peoples. Elena watched her husband interact with the children and felt her heart swell with pride and anticipation. Their child would grow up in this new world they had helped create, where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where love had proven stronger than prejudice. After the lesson concluded and the children dispersed to their various homes, Elena and Little Wolf walked together through Cedar Ridge's main street, noting the changes their courage had brought about. Henderson's general store now carried Apache-made pottery alongside Mexican wool blankets and American-manufactured goods. The saloon that had once buzzed with hostile talk about that Apache now served as meeting place for men of all backgrounds who had learned to find common ground in shared work and mutual respect. ELENA paused outside the building where Dr. Sarah Wilson, the banker's wife who had once questioned her about primitive Indian customs, now operated a clinic that combined traditional Mexican herbal remedies with Apache plant medicine and modern medical techniques. The transformation of Sarah Wilson from suspicious gossip to dedicated healer exemplified the broader changes rippling through their community. "Do you ever miss the old life?" ELENA asked Little Wolf as they settled onto the familiar bench where they had first shared meaningful conversation. "The freedom of the desert, the simplicity of warrior ways?" Little Wolf placed his hand gently on ELENA's rounded belly, feeling their child move beneath his palm like a small fish swimming in warm water. "I miss some things," he admitted, "but I would not trade this new life for all the freedom in the territory." ELENA covered his hand with her own, their wedding rings, Apache silver and Mexican gold, catching the afternoon sunlight as they contemplated the future they were building together. The teaching slate rested against her side, its surface marked with the English letters, Spanish words, and Apache symbols that their children would learn as naturally as breathing. "Our baby will be the first of a new kind of person," ELENA mused. "Neither fully Apache nor Mexican nor Anglo, but something entirely new, a bridge between worlds." Little Wolf nodded, understanding that their love had accomplished something greater than personal happiness. They had proven that human connection could transcend the artificial boundaries that fear and prejudice created, opening pathways for future generations to walk in peace. The silver and turquoise bracelet caught the firelight as ELENA adjusted it on her wrist, admiring once again the intricate craftsmanship that represented months of Little Wolf's patient work. He had created the piece during the long winter evenings when she was too heavy with child to venture far from their small adobe house, weaving together silver wire in Apache patterns with turquoise stones she had helped him select from a Mexican trader. The bracelet told their story in metal and stone, two different traditions creating something beautiful and new. Their daughter had arrived with the spring rains, a perfect child with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin. They had named her Esperanza Maria Little Wolf, hope in Spanish, honoring the Virgin in Mexican tradition, followed by her father's Apache name. The child slept now, in a cradleboard that blended both cultures, its Apache construction, decorated with Mexican embroidery that Rosa Martinez had added during countless hours of grandmother's devotion. ELENA shifted carefully in her chair, still recovering from childbirth, but insisting on attending the town meeting that would determine Cedar Ridge's future. The community had grown significantly since word spread about their successful multicultural experiment. New families arrived monthly, some Mexican, some Apache, some Anglo settlers seeking a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. The meeting took place in the community building where ELENA taught her mixed classes, but tonight the space buzzed with adult conversations about water rights, land distribution, and the economic opportunities that cultural cooperation had created. Little Wolf sat beside ELENA, his presence no longer causing nervous glances, but rather respectful nods from men who had learned to value his wisdom about desert survival and his honest dealings in trade negotiations. Mayor Franklin Pierce, his attitude transformed by months of witnessing the benefits of cooperation, stood before the assembled crowd with a proposal that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. In his hands he held the official territorial application that would make Cedar Ridge the first legally recognized multicultural settlement in Arizona territory. "Friends and neighbors," Pierce began, his voice carrying newfound respect for the diverse faces before him, "we have the opportunity to make history. The territorial government has agreed to grant Cedar Ridge special status as a multicultural community, provided we can demonstrate continued economic success and peaceful coexistence." ELENA felt Little Wolf's hand find hers as they listened to Pierce outline the legal protections this status would provide. Apache families could own land outright rather than being confined to reservations. Mexican immigrants would receive full citizenship rights regardless of their English proficiency. And most importantly, children like Esperanza would be legally recognized as full citizens with inheritance rights from both sides of their heritage. Sheriff Bradley, his badge now representing justice rather than just keeping the peace between competing prejudices, addressed the crowd with evidence of their success. Since implementing our cooperation policies, Cedar Ridge has seen a 40% increase in trade revenue, 0 violent crimes between ethnic groups, and applications from 12 new businesses wanting to relocate here. Elena thought of the bracelet on her wrist, how Little Wolf had taught her that the strongest jewelry came from interweaving different metals rather than using just one. Their community had become like that bracelet, stronger for its diversity, more beautiful for its complexity. Dr. Sarah Wilson raised her hand to speak, her transformation from gossip to healer now complete. I want to thank Elena and Little Wolf for showing us that healing, whether of bodies or communities, requires combining the best wisdom from all available sources. Our clinic's success rate has improved dramatically since we began incorporating traditional medicines from multiple cultures. Young Timothy Henderson, now 13 and fluent in 3 languages, thanks to Elena's teaching, stood up with the confidence of someone raised in a world where difference was strength. Mrs. Elena taught us that the same stars that guide Apache warriors also guided Spanish explorers and American pioneers. Maybe all our peoples were meant to end up in the same place. Elena smiled at the boy's wisdom, remembering when he had pressed his face against his mother's store window to stare at the strange sight of an Apache warrior and Mexican woman sharing civil conversation. Now he spoke 3 languages, helped translate during business negotiations, and carried messages between families that had once viewed each other with suspicion. As the meeting concluded with unanimous approval for the territorial application, Elena felt the bracelet's weight on her wrist and understood that they had accomplished something unprecedented. They had proven that love could transform not just individual hearts, but entire communities, creating new possibilities for human connection that would echo through generations yet to come. Little Wolf squeezed her hand gently as they prepared to return home to their sleeping daughter, both understanding that their greatest victory was not personal happiness, but the world they had helped create for their child. 20 years had transformed Cedar Ridge from a dusty frontier outpost into a thriving multicultural town that drew visitors from across the Southwest. Elena, now 43 with silver threading through her dark hair, stood in the town square watching her daughter Esperanza teach a group of children the same lessons about star navigation that Little Wolf had once shared with her beneath the desert sky. The wooden cradle board that had once held baby Esperanza now served as a teaching tool, its blend of Apache construction and Mexican embroidery representing the heritage she proudly claimed. The town square itself bore witness to 2 decades of unprecedented cooperation. A central fountain, built with Apache stonework and decorated with Mexican tile, provided water for travelers while serving as gathering place for the 3 communities that had learned to see themselves as one people. Around the square, businesses reflected the economic prosperity that cultural exchange had generated, a trading post that specialized in authentic crafts from all 3 traditions, a restaurant serving fusion cuisine that had become famous throughout the territory, and a school that attracted families from hundreds of miles away, seeking education that celebrated rather than suppressed cultural diversity. Little Wolf, now 52 and bearing the dignified bearing of a respected community elder, emerged from the town hall where he had been meeting with territorial officials about expanding Cedar Ridge's multicultural model to other settlements. His hair showed distinguished silver at the temples, and his face bore the lines of a man who had found peace after years of warfare. He wore a combination of traditional Apache clothing and Mexican-style silver buttons that Elena had added, a visual representation of how their marriage had blended 2 worlds. The territorial governor wants to send a delegation to Washington, Little Wolf told Elena as they walked together toward their home. They believe our model could be implemented across the Southwest to reduce conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples. Elena smiled at the irony. The same government officials who had once viewed Apache warriors as nothing more than obstacles to be removed now sought their wisdom about peaceful coexistence. Their love story had become a blueprint for something larger than personal happiness, a demonstration that cooperation created prosperity while conflict only brought suffering. Their house had grown over the years to accommodate not just their family, but the steady stream of visitors who came seeking advice about cross-cultural relationships. The original adobe structure now included a large meeting room where Elena held her cultural bridge-building workshops and Little Wolf shared traditional Apache wisdom with researchers and government officials. In the front garden, the same roses Margaret had planted decades earlier now grew alongside desert plants Little Wolf had transplanted from sacred Apache sites and herbs Elena's mother had brought from Sonora. The garden represented their philosophy made visible, different plants thriving together, creating beauty that no single tradition could achieve alone. Their children embodied this blending of worlds. Esperanza, now 20, served as official translator for the territorial government, while pursuing studies in law that would allow her to advocate for mixed families throughout the Southwest. Their son Miguel Little Wolf, 18, split his time between attending university in Tucson and learning traditional Apache hunting techniques from his father. Both children spoke 3 languages fluently and moved effortlessly between cultures that their parents had risked everything to bridge. Elena paused by the garden gate, remembering the morning 20 years ago when Little Wolf had first declared his intention to marry her. The silver cross her grandmother had given her still hung around her neck, now accompanied by the hummingbird necklace Little Wolf had crafted during their courtship. Both pieces had aged and gained patina, but their beauty had only deepened with time, like the love they represented. "Do you remember," Elena asked, "when Sheriff Bradley warned that our relationship would cause trouble for the town?" Little Wolf chuckled, the sound carrying the same warmth that had first captured Elena's heart. He was right. We did cause trouble, for prejudice, for hatred, for the narrow thinking that kept people apart. As evening approached, families throughout Cedar Ridge prepared for the weekly community gathering, where stories were shared in 3 languages, and children learned that their heritage was something to celebrate rather than hide. The gathering had become a tradition copied by settlements throughout the territory, proof that the seeds of understanding Elena and Little Wolf had planted were growing into a forest of possibility. Elena looked at the cradle board in Esperanza's hands and thought of the grandchildren who might someday sleep within its protective embrace, children who would inherit a world where love had proven stronger than fear, where different peoples had learned to see diversity as strength rather than threat. The photographer from the territorial newspaper adjusted his bulky camera equipment one final time, preparing to capture the image that would grace the front page of next week's edition. Before him stood 4 generations of the Little Wolf family, their faces telling the story of love's triumph over prejudice in ways that words alone could never convey. Elena, now a grandmother at 63, held her newest grandchild while surrounded by a family that represented the impossible made manifest. Little Wolf, silver-haired and dignified at 72, stood beside her with the quiet pride of a man who had lived to see his boldest dreams realized. Their children and grandchildren formed a constellation around them, some bearing Apache features, others showing Mexican heritage, a few displaying the mixed characteristics that marked them as citizens of a new world their grandparents had dared to imagine. The family portrait would be displayed in the newly completed Cedar Ridge Cultural Center, a building that housed artifacts and stories from all the peoples who had learned to call the town home. Among the exhibits was the very bench where Elena and Little Wolf had shared their first meaningful conversation 25 years earlier, now preserved as a symbol of how small acts of courage could transform entire communities. Little Wolf's hand found Elena's as the photographer prepared his shot, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of a quarter-century spent building something beautiful together. Elena still wore the hummingbird necklace he had given her during their courtship, its silver now darkened with age, but its message of love transcending boundaries as bright as ever. "Tell them about the morning, Papa," declared his love, urged little Maria Santos. Little Wolf, Esperanza's 6-year-old daughter, whose mixed Apache Mexican heritage made her a living bridge between her great-grandparents' worlds. Elena smiled at the child's request, remembering how many times she had told this story to visitors who came seeking proof that different peoples could indeed live in harmony. The tale had grown into legend throughout the Southwest, inspiring other cross-cultural couples to risk everything for love. "Your grandfather saw me being mocked by cruel people," Elena began, her voice carrying the storyteller's cadence she had perfected through years of teaching. Instead of walking away or pretending not to notice, he stepped forward and said 5 simple words that changed everything. "I'll marry you, so stop talk. chimed in several of the grandchildren, who knew the story by heart but never tired of hearing it repeated. The photographer captured his shot just as Elena reached the climax of her tale, freezing a moment that would endure long after all the people in the frame had returned to dust. In their faces, future generations would see proof that love could conquer hatred, that courage could overcome fear, that two people willing to risk everything for each other could create ripples of change that spread far beyond their own lives. As the photography session concluded and family members dispersed to their various homes throughout Cedar Ridge, Elena and Little Wolf remained on the cultural center's steps, watching the sun set over a town they had helped transform from a place of division into a beacon of hope. The bronze plaque beside the center's entrance bore words they had helped compose, in memory of all who dared to love beyond the boundaries others created, and in hope for all who will follow their example. Elena thought of the young couples who now traveled to Cedar Ridge, seeking their blessing before attempting their own cross-cultural marriages, of the government officials who studied their community model for implementation elsewhere, of the children growing up in a world where difference was celebrated rather than feared. "Do you think we've done enough?" Elena asked, the question that had haunted her throughout their years of public advocacy. Little Wolf considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had first attracted her to him. Around them, the sounds of a thriving multicultural community provided their own answer, children playing games that blended three traditions, merchants conducting business in multiple languages, families sharing meals that combined recipes from different heritages. "We planted seeds," Little Wolf replied finally. "Whether they grow into a forest depends on those who come after us." Elena nodded, understanding that their work was complete, but their legacy would continue through every couple, brave enough to choose love over fear, every community willing to embrace rather than exclude, every child raised to see diversity as strength rather than threat. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Elena remembered the night Little Wolf had first shared Apache star knowledge with her, teaching her to see patterns of connection where others saw only scattered lights. Their love had proven that the universe itself was built on such connections, and that human hearts brave enough to reach across divides could touch something eternal.